Welcome to the latest in the MyBPF digital series, looking this morning at the planning white paper. What do we make of the government's planning for the future proposals? I'm joined by a stellar panel whom I will introduce in a moment. We are hoping and we expect to be joined by Simon Gallagher, Head of Planning Policy at MHCLG, but he's running slightly late. So in his absence in a moment, I'm going to ask Christopher Katkowski, who's very kindly agreed to step in and give us a summary of the white paper to kick us off. I think he may have been saved by the bell because Simon is just coming in now. So whilst Simon's just getting his mind around where he is and what he's about to be asked to do, which is give us a summary of the planning white paper proposals, I will just ask all of you as participants to please feed in questions if you'd like to ask them through the Q&A function on Zoom, and I will weave in as many of your questions as I can to the conversation. But without further ado, welcome to Simon. Thank you for joining us this morning. We realise how busy you are, but we've got a packed audience virtually longing to hear more about the government's white paper proposals and to discuss them. So over to you first for a quick summary of the government's proposals, if I may, before I bring in the panel.
Thank you, and thank you very much, everybody, for joining this morning. Apologies for being a few minutes late joining. There are some connection challenges. I think it must be a feature of the weather in South London today. Let me give a bit of overview of what we've been doing. So it's nearly 3 weeks ago now that we published Planning for the Future. We've had a lot of coverage for that. Let's go to a lot of engagement and discussion from that. It is a serious white paper that proposes some significant changes to the focus of and the processes for planning in England. That is to secure better outcomes in terms of more homes, better beauty, better environmental quality, but also about making the processes around that planning more efficient, giving certainty in particular for communities, councils and developers, whilst maintaining democratic control that's important. What I want to do is just do very briefly an overview of some of the key elements that we're proposing in that white paper. I know we'll want to get into the detail and poke into the little elements of it, but I think it's quite important before we do that we have to create space just to remember how it all fits together and it all comes together. The key point and the key analysis that I think really struck us and provided the basis for this is the realisation that planning in the United Kingdom and those who follow the United Kingdom model is a relatively discretionary system by international standards, with a lot of work put into the case-by-case discussion, rather than being much more prescriptive, code-based, rules-based, as it is in a number of customs. And the question we wanted to explore was whether it's possible to make planning more predictable for the community, for the investors, and for those involved in planning locally. So the key elements of this, and I'm sure you've all read the white paper, and there'll be a test later if you haven't. Let me highlight some of the key elements, but I'll do this at pace. So first thing is that we will continue to have local plans, and we will have these, and those will continue to be prepared by councils with proper democratic engagement, but they will be stripped right back to focus on the things that really matter most. You know, what is going to happen where, what are the constraints, what is the quality standards expected. Much more visual, much more digital, much more about producing a map and being really clear on the rules of the game in that area. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and this is clearly one of our bigger ideas, is that the land in those local plans should be allocated to one of three categories: areas for growth, areas for renewal, and areas for protection. The idea there is you can be much clearer and more sharply focused to the community and to the investors about what the rules of the game are for each of them, for land in each of those categories. Then those areas which are earmarked for growth will have automatic outline permission for the uses specified in the plan through the plan itself. No need for a subsequent planning application. Detailed design sorted in line with design codes and so on. What we also want to explore is using in the renewal areas more design codes and pattern book typologies to give sort of much faster approval and less sort of discretionary approval for individual applications on those. So that this is in line with one of the ideas we've been keen to get on a fast track for beauty, is that provably popular supported designs can get ticked through the system much quicker. Fourthly, and one of the most controversial and probably most topical elements has been about setting a binding housing requirement figure for each authority, trying to get rid of the industry that goes into discussing housing need and trying to come up with a number, and then getting the choices to be made locally about how best to meet that. We're keen to do that on the basis, building on some of the ideas we've already had about local housing need, but trying to make an allowance for some of the constraints on development, whether those are flood risk or greenbelt or whatever. And we think that with that, we might be able to come up with some simplifications, like getting rid of the 5-year housing land supply test, which I think might simplify the process. Next, new processes for preparing the plans, statutory timetables with fixed milestones, fixed stages in the process, and a simpler, clearer test for plans. We've got a complex set of examination by planning or inspectorate at the moment. Could we come up with a simple test on sustainable development, cut back the evidence, and really focus the process on a much more, everybody's got to produce a plan everywhere. What do we need to do? I think is one of the questions there about interventions where those timescales aren't met. And I think that's one of the areas where we need to come back with some further thinking on there. Moving onwards, really key throughout that there should be community engagement through this process. And really want to get that. And there's been a few sort of concerns expressed, which I think we can reasonably comfortably reassure people on, that this is about taking the democracy out of planning. In fact, this is about reinforcing the democracy, but bringing it much more into the code setting and the plan making stage of things, where communities have got a real chance to influence and shape their environment. That's going to be quite a big change, but it really wants to do that. And I think there's a real opportunity there to think about how to get communities to engage in different ways, to be brought in much more innovatively than using sort of old-style, rather lengthy documents as a basis of engagement. And I think we can come up with some ways that permit much more interesting and engaging ways for communities to get involved. There's a real story at the heart of the white paper, which is one which I think is probably one of the biggest ones and one of the really important things, which is about digitising planning. We have got a planning system in England which is, there's some brilliant prop tech companies out there. There are some brilliant bits of tech being done there, but the underlying kit that we have in the public sector part of the process in particular is really just not up to the kit. How can we get a digital system, but not just make it a processing machine? How can we produce the data that enables the prop tech sector to really grow on that and to bring about the engagement that we're wanting there? I think that's a really key story which we've woven throughout the document. In terms of outcomes, I think one of the things that's been really interesting in the white paper is, I've seen less of this, although I will confess that I've been on holiday, so I may not have been following all the media on this, is we're being really sharper on the outcomes that we expect from planning. Tough on being clear that the planning's objectives must be to produce great, beautiful places and to produce better environmental outcomes. And we're keen to produce a much more improved process which delivers us faster and better environmental results without compromising on environmental standards. And I think that's an area of which I think we're going to need to do quite a lot of work together on after that. And then finishing with two things where I think I'm sure members around this table will be particularly interested in. Firstly, a new nationally set infrastructure levy to replace Section 106 on the Community Infrastructure Levy, set in a way that raises at least as much revenue and delivers at least as much on-site affordable housing, and to broaden its scope to cover permitted development. A lot of work to be done to design that, keeping the money locally so that local communities get that money, but done so in a predictable way that gives developers much more certainty about that. And then Finally, and this response to something which I know BPF members have raised a number of times with us, is about the resourcing and capability in local government. We've committed ourselves to setting out a proper resource and skills strategy to support the implementation of reforms. I think we were worried that simply trying to resource up the existing system was not the right approach. We needed to do some fundamental surgery to the system. But if we've got this new improved process, I think we need to make sure we've got the people, the skills in the right places, particularly in local government, in order to deliver that. And there's a bit of further work to be done on that. Melanie, I'm trying your patience on the time, so let me just wrap up with two things. There is a lot in there, and I would encourage everybody to read the white paper in full. The consultation stays open until the 29th of October or 1st of October for some of our shorter term measures. The messages I'd like to sort of leave with you, and I'm interested in the conversation that we have this morning, is firstly, there's quite a lot to be done to turn this into reality. This is, no government white paper ever fills in all the bits of detail, and there is a lot of work to be done to fill that. We want to work that with you, and this is an area where we are really keen to get the thinking and wisdom from the people around this virtual table and many other virtual tables. So this is a space for you to occupy and to say, okay, look, this is something you haven't filled in this story. This is what you want to do. This is how it fits with your story. So please do that. So welcome this sort of thing. And the second bit is that this is not one of those changes where MHCLG produces a new piece of paper, whether it's guidance, policy or law, and that solves it and it's all done then. This is a big sort of change which is going to involve changing the behaviours and approaches of a lot of people who are involved in this complex system that we have, that we call planning. We are going to need to engage with people like this group on an ongoing basis. And so the bit I would encourage you is, as well as offering your brains into solving some of those thorny problems, could we also ask of your engagement, time, support, and thinking about how do we actually turn this into reality? Because I think that's a really big question. Melanie, I think I've managed my timing just about okay. Shall I pass back to you at this point?
Thanks very much, Simon. Loads to go at in that. Before I let you go, though, one question coming in on the Q&A function. Could you say a few words about the interrelationship between the proposals in the white paper and London, the mayor's powers, what will happen in London and the GLA and so on?
Yeah, well, I guess there's two things. One is that the mayor is already producing a London plan under the current law, and we're in an active discussion with the GLA on that. There's a proposal from the mayor, and that will stay as it is for the short term. I think one of the questions we put out there in the white paper is, how does this need to work with the complex model of government that we have in England now, where we have got mayoral combined authorities, we've got unitaries, we've got different models of government. I think there's room for a bit of thinking to be done about what sort of types of plans we want in different areas there. But the London plan that is being produced at the moment, my expectation is that will carry on as it does now.
Thank you. And one more question for you before I finally bring in our panel. Prop tech and use of digital technology, you mentioned it, and it's clearly an important strand of thinking. What obstacles, or do you see obstacles within the public sector to embracing those opportunities and making the most of what that can do for the system?
So this is one which I could talk about for probably 40 minutes, but you don't want that. But I think the key thing is that if you look at a lot of the, planning is a data business. It's got planning systems in both in private and public sector have got loads of data locked up in those. Local authorities are doing a fantastic job operating on some sort of pretty dreadful old IT. Getting the data in that unlocked, so that it is out there, so that prop tech companies can use it, and getting a sort of much more digital portal and connection so that people can submit sort of, rather than a whole load of PDFs into a system, into real machine readable formats, is a real prize where we can really get some things going that would then enable the data to come out there and to be used much more visually and much more usefully by the sector.
Great. Thank you very much.
Those are big challenges to fix.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Okay, let's bring in our panel now. So joining us this morning, we have Claire Dutch, who is co-head of Planning and Environment at Ashurst and also vice chair of the BPF's Planning Committee. John Rhodes, Director of Quod, joining us from the Lake District. Anna Bensky, Associate Director of Peel Land and Property, and Christopher Katkowski, who's a member of the Planning Taskforce who helped to develop these proposals. So spared from having to stand in and describe them, but we'll have lots to say to us about each of them as we go through. So we thought we'd theme the webinar around 4 key topics, the first of which is plan making. So Simon's described in the proposals include fundamental changes to the role and preparation of local plans. Do you think the government's got the balance right on that? John, I'm going to come to you first.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Simon, including for the invitation to us all to contribute constructively to these big ideas. And certainly, I think the biggest idea at the heart of this is probably the change to the local plan. It's certainly, it's good to hear the local plan is going to be at the heart of the planning system going forward. And I'm certainly in favour of faster local plans, always have been. I think local plans take far too long and they're bogged down with far too much. But in a sense, what the proposals do actually is suggest faster local plans, but although they may be shorter documents, they're going to do more that's real, I think. And in particular, the idea that a local plan is going to grant planning permission, at least in bare outline, if not for more detail than that, for every major site and growth area in a district, is a real challenge. To achieve that in a shorter timescale raises real issues about whether that's practical or not. And it does raise real issues about the value of the change, if that's the principal objective, because if it's a bare outline permission, I don't think many of us see that as being very different from having an allocation in a plan. We don't normally have a difficulty in establishing the principle of development on land that's allocated. The real issue for us all is how to turn that into a development that everybody can enjoy and is viable and comes forward. So the work that we traditionally do around density, height, mix, affordable housing, infrastructure contribution, community engagement, a viable development, if all of that is genuinely to be achieved within the same local plan timescale for each site in the district at the same time, I think most of us would doubt the reality of that. And the concern is, I think, that if local plans do take on too much, then they may default to the kind of the safest assumptions. You can't really design each site in that amount of detail. So maybe local plans will default to less development on sites, or even to development that isn't tested for viability. And the risk is then that you have allocations that you can't take forward, particularly if, and I think need to be very careful through the reforms of whether there's going to be a presumption against development that isn't in the plan. Because if there is, you potentially got the double risk of an allocation that isn't the best allocation for a site, and then not be able to do very much about it. I think, trying to look positively at this, there are 3 things that I think the industry can do. One is to take this idea and use the experience that we've got on delivering larger sites, growth areas, and identify best practice for what can be achieved within the plan using approaches to parameters and proportionate assessment that we've all learned, and I think we can, between us, contribute best practice to how that can be achieved. The other thing is, and I've heard KitKat say this before, and I think it's a really good idea, that instead of just observing what's happening to your site through the plan, join in, generate evidence in relation to your plan, come up with what you think the parameters and proposals should be for your site, consult your community, so you help the local authority develop your proposals for the site. But if that evidence base that you provide to the authority isn't accepted, you also have the opportunity to object to the plan. So you don't want to be in that position, but if you are, it's an interesting proposal that the inspector would have the opportunity to replace your proposals for the local authority proposals. So the white paper, as you know, says don't just object, tell us what should happen instead. So you then have the opportunity, I think, if you're proactive, to bring forward a set of parameters and proposals for your site and say, this is a better solution for my site, and to get planning permission for that as the plan is found sound and adopted through the inspector's report. Now, if you can achieve one of those 2 outcomes, either working with the authority or generating the evidence for your site, then you really have got something, and that is something to build on.
Thanks, John. Anna, I'm going to come to you next, if I may.
Yeah, thanks Melanie. Morning everyone, great overview from Simon and some really good points John made just by you just then. So overall from our perspective, the intentions in the proposal for local plans and the preparation are great, simpler, faster system. But when we've looked at this and kind of dug deeper into the proposals, there are some things in there, some unintended consequences which may be obstructive to growth. One such example of this is the housing method. What the development industry really needs now is certainty, especially against the backdrop of COVID and the economic fallout. We and many of our peers are on the cusp of things happening. Local plans, after years in the making, are finally, some of them nearly over the finish line, working to clear timetables. And the real worry is that the rug could be pulled under us, obviously with these major, large policy reforms in the background. So really the interim measures now are absolutely crucial from our perspective. There's a great number of positives in there, stand out for us, as have been mentioned by Simon and also touched on by John. Obviously the statutory timetable for plan making, those of us that are involved in the system know that it can be torturous at times with a very many number of delays. And also we see the positive for automatic outline consents as something that could really speed things up. Just want to touch on Greenbelt. It seems to be the elephant in the room in the paper from reviewing it. There's not really tackled in terms of the strategic role it plays, and in terms of those authorities in the south that have large housing targets, how are they going to balance that with obviously the Greenbelt? In answering the question, I think the balance is right. We all want to see simpler, faster, more predictable system, which these proposals have the bones of achieving. But the bigger question really is, how will all this be resourced? So we really welcome the point in the paper that Simon touched on for a proper resourcing strategy and budgets to be put in place to achieve that. Final point that I want to make on this is plans must go forward and the momentum must be kept for those that are very nearly over the finish line.
Thank you very much, Anna. Krista, I'm going to come to you. I wonder if in making your remarks you could pick up one of the questions that's come in. Sure. To do with how we can ensure that developments take account of national energy infrastructure without, such as the gas transmission system, without having to lobby every local authority individually through the local plan. Thank you.
I think that's what's called a curved ball, I think. But
well, you could always pass it back to Simon, who I'll invite to wrap up on this section before we move on.
Simon has turned his microphone off quite rightly. Okay, let me start with what I was going to say. Do I think the government's got it right in the white paper in relation to local plans? But as I was a member of the task force, and I'm personally responsible for quite a few of the ideas, and I would say, yes, indeed, I do think the government has got the balance right. But genuinely, I really do think so. In terms of the big changes that are proposed for local plans, I mean, at the heart of this is about getting local plans in place expeditiously. And when those local plans are in place, they're going to be much more meaningful than current local plans. So in particular for the growth areas, with outline planning permissions granted in renewal areas, a local plan with an enhanced version of section 38, subsection 6 would give a big leg up to people who are proposing plan compliant development in the renewal areas, and in protected areas, well, things would be protected from development as they should be. So the idea of there being a statutory timetable is, I think, a potential game changer in this field. And the idea of having map-based, much simpler local plans, I think is highly desirable. So in relation to some of the points that have been raised, and vis-a-vis John's point, in terms of time, I just wanted to stress this because John quite rightly said, well, the industry might not actually see much purpose in having very bare outline planning permissions. But I just want to emphasize the speed at which this process will be conducted. So in 2.5 years, under the proposals in the white paper, you would have not only in today's terms, your allocation, but if you're in a growth area, your outline planning permission as well. Currently, the combination of having an allocation first, then an outline planning permission thereafter could easily take up to 10 years, easily. So the idea of getting both quickly, I think is very, very important, mustn't be lost sight of. It's, to me, a really potentially significant benefit of these proposals. Anna raised issues about needing certainty with the housing method. Well, certainly under the white paper proposals, the idea of the central government, presumably after a process, giving to each local authority its housing number would introduce absolute certainty. Anna's other point, though, is a very, very important point about local authorities potentially downing tools on plans which are emerging at the moment, thinking to themselves, well, we'll wait for the new system, if the new system is introduced in due course. And personally, I think this is a real risk. And I, was simply a member of the task force. I'm not a member of the government, obviously, but I would say to government that there's a very, very big need for central government to keep a very careful eye on local authorities in relation to this, and to come down, very heavily on any local authority that seems to be about to abandon its plan-making process because of the white paper, because that to me is completely unjustified. And I heard what Simon said earlier on about the London plan continuing under the current system. Now, as for that question that came in, Melanie, in relation to, to be quite frank, I really don't know the answer to that question. It's not, as you can see from the white paper, and I've said this elsewhere, the white paper is about big ideas, about big things, and we certainly haven't in the white paper, nor as part of the task force, drilled down to the level of detail involved in that question that's come in. It probably would be unfair to ask Simon whether he has an answer to it, because it really doesn't feature as a point in the white paper. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Being mildly unfair then, Simon, anything you want to add on that point, or before we wrap up this section on plans and then we'll move on to another topic?
Well, just to say that, I think it is a good question. The answer with a lot of things on the energy system is a good national policy statement, because a lot of the projects come forward under the national significant infrastructure process, and getting up to date national policy statements which are clear on those needs, I think is a key part of that. And I would encourage team to have a conversation with my colleagues at the Department for Business if they don't think that gives enough planning certainty for those.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's move on to another topic. Yes, John.
I'll just ask Kat a question in response to one of the points I made, which is the extent to which local plans are being encouraged to look at a bare outline, or are they being encouraged to go further than that and develop master plans, design briefs, or design codes for individual sites?
Certainly the task force's ideas, which come through in the white paper, do envisage local plans being made and having the ability to incorporate master plans, to having the ability to incorporate more than just the parameter of, for example, height. So that's certainly set out in the white paper as a potential for these new style local plans to do more than simply be bare outline planning permissions. There's also, as you know, in the white paper, in effect, an option as to whether local plans should also include what I would call pattern books loosely, the idea of detailed consents in effect for particular types of development. And the white paper speaks of the ideal being that local plans would incorporate that level of detail, which to my mind would be wonderful if they could, but also giving local authorities, if that's too much for them to do in the timescale, giving them the ability to bring forward design codes, pattern books, etc., through supplementary planning documents. So there's certainly in the white paper proposals, there's plenty enough there to allow a new style local plan to do more than give the barest of bare outline consents. And so that's how I would answer your question, John.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let's move on to another topic and touch on environmental assessment. So I think the aim of the game is simplification, Simon, so that the process by which sustainability appraisals and strategic environmental assessments are undertaken is more simple. And again, come back to maybe possibly to that word around certainty, just giving people a bit of clarity, more clarity around the process. So what will the government need to consider in those reforms? Claire, I'm going to come to you first on this.
I think the proposal to streamline environmental assessment shock waves of horror amongst the environmental groups. I think it's sensible, provided it genuinely means a reduction in paper and not a reduction in environmental protection. We cannot have that, particularly now with climate change, commitment to net zero, and the commitment to have a green recovery from COVID. So we cannot water down environmental protection, but I don't think that is the intention. I think that's been a little bit misunderstood. On plan making, we're told that sustainability appraisals are out, which isn't such a bad thing in my opinion, but I hope we are saving strategic environmental assessment or something like its equivalent, because as we've just heard, plans are going to be far more prescriptive. They're going to set height, they're going to set density, and we're going to have to look at this properly from an environmental perspective to check that the plan passes this new sustainable development test. So we cannot cut corners on the plan making. Someone's got to look at daylight and sunlight. Someone's got to look at traffic impacts. So it's very important at the plan making stage that the environmental assessment is done correctly if the plan's more prescriptive. At the application stage, if the application matches the plan, which, let's face it, that's the whole thrust of this, that's the whole intention, then yes, there is scope to cut down on EIA, because the plan will have done the job. It will have looked at the environmental assessment. And I think that's a good thing. You know, the sheer scale of environmental statements we all see every day that run to 3-4 tomes of paper. You know, if we can cut down on that is a good thing, but it's all predicated on the environmental effects being assessed at the plan stage. My final point on this, this is an idea the government has put out there, but part the detail. Understandably. One suggestion is how it's going to work. We're going to have standardized local and national environmental data, and we're all going to tap into it, all going to be able to share the same data. Again, who's going to collate that? More importantly, who is going to keep it up to date? It's got to be up to date, and it keys into the general themes about the white paper: resources and practicalities. How is it going to work in practice? And I was comforted to hear from Simon before that he said this is an area there's a lot more work we can do together to make the environmental assessment side work.
Thank you, Claire. John?
I agree, Claire. I thought that was very well said. I agree with all of that. And I think that the white paper is onto a winner here in principle. We all spend far too much time wading through environmental assessments or sustainability appraisals that don't actually tell us what we want to know. And I think the best in the industry have been moving recently towards what we would call environmental planning rather than environmental assessment, which is understanding what the environment is telling you so that you can improve developments. And I think, Claire, there is a lot of good work going on in the National Environmental Database, and I think we can see the practicality of that part of the solution as well. And again, as Simon said, I think there's a lot of work to be done here, but that's not to be daunted by it. It's good work and it's a good direction, and it's a direction that many of us have been starting to follow, but really will be prompted by this to find a proportionate way of doing environmental assessment. There are real challenges, of course, because I don't think it's clear how much a local plan is going to take on in terms of site development and what a proportionate environmental assessment of that looks like. It will vary, I think, from one site or one authority to the next. If detail is deferred to SPD or design codes later, you know, how much is assessed at the plan stage and how much is there a requirement for a second stage of assessment? But those are kind of details that need to be worked up around the principles of what's being proposed. The principle of being approved is really using environmental assessment strategically in an intelligent way to inform outcomes is definitely the thing to do.
Thank you. And Christopher?
Thank you very much indeed. Well, music to my ears to hear positive support on this. Of all the proposals in the white paper, this is the one which is closest to my heart. I've been asked elsewhere, desert island disc style, what would be the one thing I would save from the white paper if everything else had to go, and this is it. The obsession that we have in looking at environmental issues, both in terms of SA, SEA and EIA, sorry about all these acronyms, But at plan making and planning application stage, the obsession we have with process over outcomes really, really has to stop. And we really do need to find a simpler, streamlined, sensible way in which we can do what we should have been doing for years, which is look at the environmental consequences of decisions that face local planning authorities, inspectors and so on and so forth in dealing with planning. Whereas at the moment at plan making, I mean, those of us who practice in the field would be familiar with seeing hundreds of pages of colours, ticks and crosses, impenetrable to any ordinary member of the public, and I include myself as one of those. Absolute nonsense. In the planning application stage, my favourite little anecdote, but it's true, planning application of mine in central London for billions of pounds of investment, environmental statement now running to 4,000 pages. No one involved in making the decision in that case is going to read those 4,000 pages and take them into account in deciding whether to say yes or no to the proposed development. This has to stop, and there has to be a simpler, streamlined way in which we can look at the environmental consequences of the decisions that face all of us in this field. But just to reassure all of the people who are listening to this, all of the delegates and the other panelists, it was no part of the task force's thinking, and certainly nothing I see in the white paper deflects from this, no part of our thinking to in any way downgrade environmental protection, to in any way take one's eye off the ball of environmental issues. Quite the opposite. What we're trying to do is to find a way in which we actually do concentrate on environmental issues and environmental consequences of the decisions that face us, rather than on process. So, as you can tell, I feel very passionately about this.
Thank you very much. Claire, I wonder if I could just come back to you briefly on this topic, just picking up one of the questions. Is one of the reasons why we sort of descend into this mire of process a skills issue or a resourcing issue, picking up that theme about resourcing of local authorities again? I mean, have we got the right skills in local authorities to deliver the kind of vision that Christopher and you and John have passionately talked about in terms of focusing on outcomes and being confident, you know, not to require more and more information to try and get to the outcome, but really cutting through that? Is resourcing one of the key issues here?
I think we don't have resources in the local authorities under the current system. The poor local authority EIA officer does not have the skills to, or time or resources to wade through 4 volumes of an ES. I think in terms of moving to this new system, if it works and we're focused on outcomes and it is streamlined, there'll just be a change of approach, a change of culture, and it will free up resources because there'll be nationalised, standardised assessments, there'll be standardised data. So I'm hoping that once we've got over the hurdle of the change, it will be better. It will free up resources.
Thank you. Okay, let's move on to another topic then, housing numbers. We've touched on this already in Anna's remarks. So ambitious changes, both short-term and longer-term actually, to the way in which housing needs calculated. So is this an improvement? And will they deliver, the new proposals deliver a fair distribution of housing across the UK? Anna?
Thanks, Melanie. We do support the approach of the standard methodology, but as you might have picked up, we have significant concerns with the proposals. We recognise that there are significant affordability problems in London and South East, and obviously the method does work to address that, but in doing so, it does overlook the regions. We are a key investor in the North, and the numbers are not what we'd like to see, and we don't think they are ambitious enough. Just to put this into context, out of the target, the national target of circa 300,000, the North only receives 50,000, 15%, despite being home to 25% of the population. This clearly seems at odds with levelling up, which is obviously also referenced in the paper. And we feel that it really overlooks the North in terms of the role that the North has to play, especially in the economy and the recovery post-COVID. Just another point to pick up on, which we're slightly concerned about, that's referenced in the proposals, and that's the 10-year plan period. From our perspective, that's just too short a timescale. We do note that it says minimum, but it's just too short a timescale for any large-scale strategic planning. And it also, from our point, could potentially disincentivise long-term strategic investment. essentially, we just want to get on and deliver. We've established a house builder, Northstone, to do just this, and we really need to be ready to accelerate and also to realise the potential of the North. But the points that I've just previously outlined could represent a fairly significant stumbling block to our large-scale plans. So in answering the question, no, we don't feel that it's a fair distribution of the numbers, but we do have ideas around how this could work, both for London and the regions, and we'll be submitting it as part of the consultation proposals.
Music to Simon's ears. Thank you, Anna. You've picked up on one of the questions that came in right at the start around how we translate the outcome of the standard method into binding local housing agreements and how we strike that balance between locally assessed needs and meeting the national target for 300,000 homes. So thank you for doing that. John, to you next.
Thank you. It's probably important to say that there are two different consultations going on at the moment. There's one going on to revisions to the standard methodology, and that's tending to get a few headlines, I noticed particularly this morning. And it's actually separate entirely from the planning white paper, which talks about having a methodology, but doesn't say what that methodology would be. So obviously everybody's interested in both parts of that. In principle, I strongly support the idea of a standard methodology. I think Kat and I are both partly to blame for the current standard methodology, which came out of the recommendations of LPEG, almost literally the idea that you could cut 2 years out of the plan process by having an app on your phone, which tells you at a simple calculation how many houses you should start your local plan with. These proposals go further and suggest actually you don't even need an app on your phone because the government's going to tell you the answer for your local authorities. And I think there are just one or two important things to say about that. One is recognising that no standard methodology is going to get things right. It's going to come up with slightly odd side effects. The one that Anna's identified particularly, the North getting less housing from the new revised suggested standard methodology than it probably should have. But there'll be other quirks in the system as well. And I think actually the white paper provides an opportunity because instead of using the standard methodology from time to time as you do a 5-year supply calculation or your new local plan, the government is going to tell you what the standard methodology means for you. And that gives the government the opportunity to, if you like, be a bit policy on with this, and I think go further than the white paper suggests, to say, guided by the standard methodology, not a slave to it, but guided by it, government has decided that this should be the distribution to particular geographical areas, and it would give the opportunity to say, that's an interesting result from the standard methodology, but we want to adjust it for the North, or whatever it might be. Not keep trying to find a formula that produces the precise answer, but taking the formula and then making a policy on decision. And then the white paper suggests, well, we can go further and have a methodology that takes account of environmental constraints. And I'm concerned about that because I don't think it can, and I don't think it would achieve local acceptance. But I think the principle of nevertheless having a fixed figure which takes account of environmental constraints is a great one, and it would certainly accelerate the plan process. And I think the way to do it would be to build on the white paper proposals so that government devolves the standard methodology distribution to areas rather than specific local authorities and encourages them to work together. There's reference to this in the white paper. So authorities in a combined authority area or in a county could see if they could come up with a slightly different distribution for their area because they know how to mediate the environmental constraints in their area, but only be given a short time to do that. And if they can't, then the standard methodology would be the default. Just a short process because authorities know what their constraints are and can work together to come up with the best distribution for their county, say. But then that's fixed. You don't need a duty to cooperate, that's fixed, and the plan knows how to proceed. So I think with a little bit of adjustment, the principle of the idea in the white paper is exactly the right idea.
Thank you. Christopher.
Thanks very much indeed. Well, it's another one of the big ideas in the white paper, which, quite, as John was quite rightly saying, mustn't be confused with the other consultation on changes to the current system for the standard methodology. So as a member of the task force, I was involved in producing the white paper, but not the other consultation. So in relation to the white paper's proposals, I mean, yes, there's a lot potentially to gain from the new version that we propose as a task force through the white paper. And certainly, as John has said, I mean, there's absolutely no reason at all why in the design that we've put forward, which is the design at the level of a big idea, there's absolutely no reason at all why that design can't enable the government to take policy on, to use the jargon, policy on decisions about the distribution of housing numbers across the country. It'd be very, very sensible in my mind to do that. As for taking on board environmental constraints, I mean, this would be the biggest difference between whatever the new methodology would be and the current, or even a consulted upon standard methodology. This would be the biggest difference. The idea of the government actually saying to each local authority or each area where housing numbers are handed out, well, we understand your environmental constraints. This is our judgment as to how your housing number should be adjusted accordingly. Now, to my mind, what we really would need to achieve to deliver this would be a process which enables all the issues to be looked at properly and fairly. And as long as there is such a process before the numbers are distributed by government, then as far as I'm concerned, this is a very, very sensible idea indeed. And certainly, John, I would anticipate that various players in the industry, so to speak, everyone interested in housing delivery will be suggesting ways in which this idea can be converted into reality. And personally, as far as I'm concerned, if I ever have any part to play in this in the future, I mean, I'd be very, very interested indeed in formulating a process which would allow the government to do what the white paper suggests it should do. So I think there's a lot of promise in these ideas, because the idea of being able to say to a local authority, here's your number, now make your plan, rather than let's spend years arguing about the number is a good idea.
Thank you. And just sort of staying with that theme then, just picking up a question that's just come in. So what's the scrutiny and oversight? Is this subject to consultation? Would there be subject to judicial review if there's a disagreement between the national and local views? Could you say a word about that?
Well, from my perspective, this all feeds into what I've just referred to as need to find a fair process to enable all the issues to be examined. John's just made a point about having numbers in effect given to a housing distribution area, or a county, for example, where the standard method, the new standard method, the white paper standard method would say to each authority, here is your number. That would be the default number. The members of that county, the constituent authorities of that county, or the constituent authorities of a combined authority, or the constituent authorities of a city such as London, would debate amongst themselves the distribution of those numbers. And if they can agree a distribution between them that takes on board all these various constraints, then that would be put to government. And in the process, there could be an option for the government simply to adopt that agreed redistribution. If they can't agree, then one would default to the original numbers. But this is all about finding a process. As for judicial review, I mean, really, to be honest, and I say this as a planning practitioner, QC, been doing the job for nearly 40 years. It's about time we try to take the lawyers out of planning to some or other extent, because the idea that we are so obsessed with these process issues, and we really need to find sensible and fair ways to get to the desired outcomes, not become obsessed with tripwires. The current planning system is full of hurdles and tripwires, things getting in the way of making sensible decisions. So, yes, I suspect if something went catastrophically wrong, of course there'd be the ability to do judicially review. But really, we should be looking at this in a positive way. I mean, can't we design a system that works, that isn't one which immediately ends up in the High Court? I hope we can.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to move to the last topic. Simon wants to come in, yes.
I was just going to come in just to back that. Well, I think one of the things that we are concerned about across the whole of planning, and in England, is the level of risk aversion in there, is that people are not doing sensible decisions for fear that they might be tripped up on a process issue. And can we encourage things where people are doing good things to be more empowered to make those decisions? Can we introduce more certainty into it? And one of the key words we've put a lot in the white paper is this point about certainty. At the moment, there is so much risk involved in development for communities, but particularly for investors. We've got to do better at doing that. And I think the question is, how can we build that certainty which reduces the need for discretionary decisions, which are always subject to a greater degree of challenge?
Thank you. Simon, while you've got the floor, I will, as I move into our last topic, which is developer contributions and single infrastructure levy. One of the questions that's come in from the floor is whether you support the proposals that Section 106 agreements ought to be abolished. It's actually an impassioned defence, if you read the full question, of Section 106 and all the things it delivers. Isn't it unwise to scrap Section 106 altogether? By all means, slim them down to these 106s up, but remember all the good things they do. Do you want to say a word to introduce our topic on our conversation on developer contributions?
Yeah, why don't I? And I think it's a really good question in there. So I think one of the things that we have been concerned about, and I've heard this from so many people in all sides of things, is that how much time is now taken by a debate about particularly about the affordable housing element of a Section 106 contribution. And in line with what I've just said a moment ago about certainty and predictability, can we come up with something which is a much more predictable, certain way, which means that for the community who are frustrated as hell at the moment, that they sign up to something and then they actually get something substantially less than that. And for the developer who has to embarks on the process, particularly the small guys, embarks on the process and have no idea what they're going to get asked to pay through there. We must be able to do something which gives a greater degree of certainty into the system. That's the core of the proposition. Now, it is absolutely right that there are a whole load of other things which are covered in Section 106 agreements. And I think one of the things we've left open is where do those go? How do we get those? I think there's... I'm sort of in the space of there's some white space here that I encourage you to fill on where those might go. I think what I don't want to do is see another process which means that planning permission turns out not to be an implementable consent because you've now got another 2 years of negotiating on something else there. But is there something where the sensible bits of the conversation that need to happen get discussed? Absolutely key. We must find ways of doing that.
Thank you, Simon. Claire, white space to fill.
Yes, definitely. Well, I think the idea of a simple one payment, one size fits all levy is attractive, but let's not forget this is where we started with SIL 10 years ago. And the moment you start to create a levy, you inevitably have to look at exemptions. Surely charities are going to be exempt at the very least. All the rules about how you offset the affordable housing from the levy. What do you do with the thorny issue of Section 73s, which has caused so much trouble in the past? And call me a cynic, I don't think we're going to end up with a nice, tidy, simple levy. Particularly, let's face it, we are blatantly in the world of land value capture here. We've moved straight forward, plunged with both feet into that, and the levy is going to be based on the final value of the development. So I take from that the GDV, and I know we want to reduce all this number crunching arguments about viability. When we're going to have to agree, the local authority and the applicant, what the GDV is on a multi-phased complex development, suddenly SIL, where you just get your floor space and times it by the relevant levy, seems quite simple in comparison. So I think there's issues on the infrastructure levy. Back to 106 now. As a planning lawyer, you would expect me to talk about 106. I will lay my cards on the table. I genuinely think there is still a role for 106, and to scrap it all together will leave a gaping gap. 106, it's not perfect. We all know that. Work can be done on standardising drafting, maybe using it for the bigger sites only. But at the end of the day, it's a very flexible tool that deals with a whole host of necessary issues to enable that development to go ahead. And those issues cannot easily lend themselves to planning conditions. So long-term stewardship of public realm, public open space, site-specific infrastructure that needs to be delivered. Sustainable travel and transport is more than pounds, shilling and pence in a 106. And equally, the developer has the comfort of getting reciprocal legal obligations back from the council. So if it pays £5 million for a school, it's going to get something back that says the school will be open in time for their development to be occupied. So this isn't self-serving. I genuinely think scrapping 106 altogether is going to leave a gaping gap.
Claire's always right about everything. So I do think the government has for a long time underestimated the importance of 106, but I won't repeat what Claire said. just flip to the alternative, which is you pay your money, somebody else delivers your infrastructure. Who's that going to be? I think there's a real challenge, both from communities who need that infrastructure in place, but also for developers who want to know when that infrastructure is coming forward, that if it's not being delivered through their 106, is the local authority really going to do it? And if this is a big idea that's going to fly, it does need a lot of work, and we need to think about different ways of doing things. We need to think about public-private partnerships, delivery agencies, taking that money to make sure the important things happen. And also just not underestimate the complexity of value, as Claire says. So, and the idea that we'll have a levy that's the same for different land uses, for instance, have people really thought through what the impact would be on employment development of having the same levy as housing currently carries? I'm not sure that they have. And similarly, trying to kind of dumb down land value to say we'll make a standard flat charge allowance for land value. The consequence of that is almost certainly less brownfield development, more greenfield development, because it ignores the existing use value of land. It's a very complex area. There is a prize out there if you can get it right, definitely, simplicity, but it needs an awful lot of work.
Thank you very much. Anna, I'm going to come to you next. In doing so, though, I'm just going to note that Simon may need to drop out while you're speaking. You shouldn't take it personally at all. He's off to fight the good fight with number 10 on our behalf, armed by all the things he says. So if you need to drop out, Simon, whilst we're still talking, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. And best of luck in all your endeavours. Anna, over to you.
Thanks, Melanie. Some really valid points made there by Claire and John. We welcome simplifying the approach, and I'm sure most people in the development industry do. The upfront certainty that it would give as well, very, very much welcomed. And another standout point, charge and occupation, obviously would avoid upfront capital costs. We are apprehensive, though, about a one-size-fits-all approach. I'm sure you'd all agree that, land values vary throughout the country, which could have significant implications. And the actual proposal itself, when reading through it, left us with very many unanswered questions. I suppose from our perspective, as long as the payments are fair and proportionate, that allow us to get on and deliver and build, then we'll be happy. But the system must incentivise landowners, and the risks and rewards must be shared. Bye, Simon, looks like you're going now. It's clear that great planning brains have drafted these proposals, but most importantly, especially for this proposal, it now needs development industry input, especially from those who understand the land market.
Thank you, Anna. That's actually a great note to finish on, because I did promise I'd try and wrap up by 11 for everybody. And it goes right back to what Simon said at the start, I think, which is, the government is keen to hear views. We have to get engaged. We have to get involved as an industry to fill in the blanks, to colour in the proposals that are very high level and conceptual at this stage. So absolutely rallying call to finish with, to say, everybody, thank you so much to everyone on the webinar today. We could have gone on for at least another hour. One of the questions that I didn't get a chance to talk about was, we didn't talk about it much this morning, community engagement, particularly in those areas designated for growth, and how we continue to make that meaningful and real. So it may be that we need to do another one of these, which I'm sure the team is relishing the opportunity to do. But thank you so much to all of my panel this morning. Thank you to everybody who joined us, and thank you for all the questions, and apologies if I didn't get to your question. And we hope to see you all again soon as part of our My BPF digital series. Thank you all very much.